It is a great and somber privilege, and with a heavy heart, that I enter into this emergency debate this evening in support of the motion before us, expressing our unwavering support for Ukraine's people, their sovereignty and territorial integrity, condemning Russia's wanton invasion of Ukraine, and calling on Russia to cease and withdraw all military operations within Ukraine immediately. Listening to speakers from both sides of the House share their stories of connections with Ukraine is humbling. I'm reminded of our shared humanity, our common interests as fellow Canadians, to live in a free and fair democracy. For most of us, that means free from persecution, free to pursue our dreams, and free of the threat of invasion from neighboring countries. I want to thank the member from Saskatoon Centre who shared with us the history and the importance of the Kopans Ukrainian scarves to her culture and their close link with the immigrant women whose relationships they symbolize. It reminds me that we are all connected through time and space, through the land that we all share, and the histories of our people. It reminds me of a song a primary school teacher used to lead us in when I was a young schoolgirl. It was called One Tin Soldier. Does anyone remember that song? It tells the story of two warring people fighting to gain control of this mountain. And when the people of the valley fight their adversaries to the death and reach the summit, they turn the stone and look beneath it. Peace on earth is all it said. One wonders why, after so many atrocities stemming from around the world, including 2 world wars, that such lessons can be so hard to understand. Now, I'm not so naive to be unaware of the complex geopolitical events antecedent to this crisis. But let us not forget that right before Russia invaded Ukraine, Canada was experiencing its own democratic crisis with the occupation of Ottawa by protesters opposing federal and provincial epidemiological restrictions in response to a global pandemic. And I don't bring it up to debate that unfortunate event, but simply to point out the stark contrast between what is occurring in Ukraine with what is being alleged in terms of infringement on rights of Canadian citizens and the social contract under which we enjoy, and even at sometimes take for granted, our freedoms as a democratic society. I think we're all interested in raising the level of respectful debate in the legislature, but I cannot allow it to go unmentioned that our Premier was unwilling to take a decisive stand on the conduct of protesters in Ottawa who are now facing criminal prosecution for his own political gain, and so as not to offend radical extremists within his own party. The events taking place in Ukraine stand in stark contrast to that, where democratic freedoms are truly in great peril. Watching the events unfold in Ukraine, the situation is devastating. And we've heard many stories here today on the personal connections members of this legislature have with Ukrainian citizens, sheltering in bunkers in Kyiv, in Sumy, in Mariupol, and elsewhere. 2 weeks ago, the Saskatchewan NDP Provincial Council unanimously passed an emergency resolution to fully support and stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. In the days following the Russian invasion, the leader of the official opposition wrote a letter to our Premier calling for unity and collaboration through the Saskatchewan-Ukrainian Relations Advisory Committee to include all members of the Legislative Assembly to facilitate the work to support those impacted by the crisis, the settlement of refugees, and coordinate needed financial and humanitarian support. So far, that request has gone unanswered. As I've said, so many of us are personally touched by these tragic events. I had the great privilege to travel to Ukraine in the summer of 2019 as an election observer in the parliamentary elections following President Zelensky's inauguration that same year. I was part of a delegation of 850 observers from more than 40 countries, including almost 200 Canadian volunteers, and including many who participated through the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. The mission was organized by the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which is an arm of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. What an incredible opportunity to travel to a part of Europe with such a rich history, integral to the settlement of Western Canada, including my own grandparents and great-grandparents. As a second and third generation Polish Canadian, it was thrilling to imagine what life must have been like for my ancestors as peasants from small farming communities, surviving the many war conflicts that have touched that region through the centuries, juxtaposed with the emerging modern democratic society observed until only just recently in Ukraine. It hits me with great impact to realize the important work I had the privilege to be a part of through that election observation mission to ensure free and fair elections in this emergent democracy since the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Last week, I made contact with my translator in the city of Sumy in eastern Ukraine, 40 miles from the border with Russia, to ensure hers and her family's safety. Thankfully, they were safe thus far, although their city has been seized and they live under control of authoritarian rule. I think of the beautiful city of Kyiv, where I was stationed briefly, in all its magnificence, of the Maidan uprising in 2014, and my heart aches for people who only want to possess their sovereignty as a free democratic society and is now a city facing ruin. Ukraine is ethnically diverse. My maternal grandfather, Marian Kruczynski, of mixed Polish-Ukrainian ethnic heritage, was born in the town of Kopyczyncy, a town located in the Ternopil Oblast, near the border with Poland. This is a part of Europe that has changed hands throughout the centuries. At the time of my grandfather's birth, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He immigrated to Canada in the 1920s, met and married my grandmother, Mariam Swiderski, of Polish descent, and part of a larger Polish-Ukrainian diaspora in the area near Ituna and Rama, with family names like Karkut and Malinowski. My grandparents lived a long and prosperous life here in Saskatchewan, with many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, seeing their 4 children prosper, each receiving university educations, their dreams realized. To this day, my mother, Eleanor Ritchie, maintains strong ties with her Ukrainian-Polish cousins back in the old country. Last week, we learned that my relatives who live outside Lviv, near the border with Poland, and whom I only know distantly, are fine, but a young nephew who recently turned 18, is waiting to be called up to serve. As a mother with a young adult son, my heart aches for them especially. The residents of Kopachinski today are mobilizing to provide supplies for both soldiers fighting Russian forces and people fleeing for their lives. And so it touches me personally, as it does all of us, as we think of our fellow men and women, the young and old, experiencing this tragedy from one end of Ukraine to the other. The people of Saskatoon-Nutana, like all constituencies across this great province, have deep and lasting ties with the people of Ukraine. I think in gratitude of retired scholar and Professor Emeritus Bohdan Kordan of Ukrainian descent, who founded the Prairie Center for the Study of Ukrainian Heritage. And I think of the many families throughout Saskatchewan who are touched by these tragic events. How lucky we are to live in this great country. So many of us descendants of settlers from foreign countries, fleeing poverty and persecution. And how fortunate we are to be able to live in relative prosperity, sharing this land as treaty people in a relationship that we are only now beginning to reconcile through the TRC calls to action. As the events of the past month here in Canada have demonstrated so clearly, democracy is fragile. It takes work, and it should never be taken for granted. As we come together to express our solidarity with Ukraine and pray for peace and the spirit of a nation so bravely embodied in their leader, President Zelensky, let us not forget that we are all one in this humanitarian project of building a fair and just and democratic world. It's encouraging to see the people of Saskatchewan come together to provide humanitarian relief and support for refugees. That is a true spirit of a people who come together from many people's strengths. This is not a time for political divisions or partisan politics. At times like these, we must be united in our full support for the people of Ukraine. We should be using every tool at our disposal to maximize pressure on the Russian government to peacefully exit Ukraine, and that includes leveraging our trade offices, trade missions, and organizations to pressure countries relying on Russian potash, grains, and energy to hamstring Putin's ability to finance this invasion. We should continue to call on the federal government to expedite visa applications for those fleeing Ukraine, and I welcome the efforts made thus far to increase supports for refugee resettlement. Saskatchewan can play a key role in raising funds with the Canada-Ukraine Foundation by matching donations to help them reach their goal of $5 million to provide assistance to Ukrainians in need and to address any further aggression by Russia. Let's continue to work together and show our support for the humanitarian efforts in Ukraine, support their defense, and do all we can to bring an end to this brutal invasion as quickly as possible and without further human loss and destruction. Slava Ukraine!